Hello everyone, I'm the Noodle, and I'm going to tell you how I mained Hwei from Silver to Diamond. I'll be going into detail on every aspect of playing Hwei, including how his abilities work, matchups, runes, so on and so forth. If you make it through the whole video and want to see more content like this, then hit that like and subscribe and check out my other videos. Now, before I get into the details, I'm going to give a little backstory as to how I got here. Since this video is going to be long, I'll have timestamps for every segment, so you can skip ahead of this to the actual gameplay guides if you don't want to hear about the LP gains and whatnot. So, in Season 13, I was an ADC main and a mid laner secondary. As many of you probably know, the ranked system was god-awful last year, especially after the introduction of Emerald, with people like myself experiencing LP gains as low as 14 per win and as high as 31 per loss, despite having a 60% win rate. After reaching Emerald 1 with 98 LP and proceeding to get demoted in the next few matches, I decided to hang it up until next season, where Riot had promised to fix the LP system to avoid things like this in the future. Fast forward to Season 14, where Riot functionally buried the role of ADC under a mountain of items for every other class. I was having no luck in my matches playing ADC and decided to pick up Hwei as a mid lane main instead. Following that, my MMR tanked so hard that I was right back to losing 30 LP per loss and said screw it and went to an alternate account. So that's where I started, a Hwei main on a fresh account in Silver 1. Silver and Gold were easy to climb through since I was win streaking and getting an average 27 LP per win. This stayed relatively true throughout Platinum as well, and my LP gains didn't change much until I got into Emerald, where it slowly dwindled down to about 22 LP per win despite having a 63% win rate. If you've never played an Emerald Elo, then let me tell you, it is the worst experience of my life. There's a strange threshold in Emerald where the players are either punching above their weight and should probably be in Diamond, while other players are literally worse than Iron both mechanically and mentally. I played probably over 10 games in Emerald 1 alone before getting promoted, just going up and down, and it was the most frustrating experience. You get people flaming, inting, dodging, and asking for surrenders before they even make it to lane. My advice for getting out of Emerald is to focus on your mental. There's a lot of players that are obviously good enough to be higher than their rank, but often get held back by their mindset, whether it's because they surrender too often or tilt too easily because of little things like losing first blood. If you're playing ranked for multiple hours straight, then having these players on your team can get to you and even make you play worse without you realizing it. The best thing you can do is ignore them and play to the best of your ability. If you know that chat makes you angry or throws you off your game, then turn it off. Trust me, it will make your life way better, and unless you're playing the role of team leader and trying to make callouts, then you really don't need to have it on. Another thing that affects so many players is the FF mentality. And whether you like it or not, if surrendering is ever an option to you, then you're part of the problem. If you go into a game where you only have a 30% chance of winning, then you still have a chance, where if you decide to surrender, then obviously your chances of winning go straight to zero. If you want to win more games, then don't ever make surrendering an option for yourself, no matter how bad it looks. Too many players think that being 0-3 by 10 minutes is a guaranteed loss, but comeback potential in League is probably the highest it's ever been. So even if the chances of winning are low, it's still better than zero. I know from my experience climbing that nobody wants to be wrong, and admitting that you're wrong can be extremely hard when you're having a bad game. I'm not afraid to admit that I have fallen into that mentality before and ended up winning a lot of games that I had originally tried to surrender. And once you experience that, your whole outlook on games will change. So from one very frustrated player to another, if you stop trying to surrender, then you will win more games. Moving into pre-game lobby, there's a heap of obstacles to get over. Dodging is one of the biggest issues that you'll see when trying to queue up. I know there's a lot of debate to be had about dodging, but in my opinion, there are only a couple reasons I think are acceptable. First reason is if your house is on fire and you need to go take care of it or something like that. An emergency. Second reason is trolls. Popular streamer Azzapp has been the pioneer for the anti-FF culture, and God bless his soul for it. I think he's made a huge impact on a lot of players for the better, but there is one statement of his that I can't quite agree with. He mentioned that dodging a game because you have someone threatening to run it down or make a troll pick isn't good because they get away with it instead of being forced to play the match and get punished for it. However, in my experience, I have tested this many times and have been forced to play out these games, and not even in the game where I had a Twitch jungle with no smite, literally running it down mid, he did not get punished despite being reported for it. So in my opinion, if you have someone on your team that is almost certainly going to lose your game on purpose and you don't feel like losing the LP, then by all means dodge. On the other hand, let's talk about one of the biggest reasons you shouldn't dodge a game. Bad matchups. I understand that sometimes you get counterpicked and that makes your lane hard, but it's these matchups that have the most to learn from, especially as a one-trick. Only playing matchups that favor your champion is good for winning more games, but in the long term you'll never grow as a player if you don't learn the hard ones. You only have one ban, and no matter how wisely you use it, you're going to play against champions you don't want to, even if it means you might lose. With that said, let's start talking about Hwei himself and how and why I chose to main him. As a player, I always look for a champion that is able to have a high impact on their game even if they're not super fed. Most of that impact comes from high utility. For example, my main ADC in Season 13 was Jhin, since he has the potential to do a ton of damage, but even when put behind, he still brings a lot to the table with his traps, long-range CC, and a really strong teamfight ultimate. Hwei is similar in the sense where he effectively has 9 different options for his basic abilities while also having the potential to do a ton of damage. This array of options includes higher damage, wave clear, shields, movement speed, different CC options, so on and so forth. So let's run down these abilities really quick. Hwei's passive is pretty simple and allows him to trade in lane since his early game damage is pretty low. I'll put the cards on screen for all the abilities, but basically hitting a champion with 2 different spells in a short amount of time will cause a burst of damage in an area beneath them after a short delay. This becomes pretty trivial late game and is essentially just bonus damage in most fights, but it's pretty crucial that you utilize this during laning phase in order to have successful trades. I'll come back to this after we talk about the rest of his abilities when I actually go over lane. For clarity's sake, I will be referring to each ability and its options as Q1 through 3, W1 through 3, and E1 through 3, and for all intents and purposes, you should max Q, E, then W while obviously putting points into your ultimate at 6, 11, and 16. As for which ability to take first and second during laning phase, I'll get to that as well in a minute. Q1 is a straight line skill shot that does damage in an area after hitting a unit or after reaching its maximum range. This is a huge asset for farm and trading in lane since it has pretty decent size and damage, so it's hard to miss. Q2 is an AoE with a massive range that brings down a bolt of damage after a brief delay. This ability has really good execute potential because it does bonus % health damage the lower the target is, and also does bonus damage if the target is isolated or immobilized. So it's basically worthless unless you can meet those requirements and does basically no damage to anyone with full health. Q3 is a straight line that creates a rift underneath the area, slowly doing damage over time and slowing any targets on it. This is your bread and butter for wave clear, wave control, and zoning. Honestly, it does okay damage, but only if the target stays on it for the full duration, and clearing waves with it early is pretty slow. The best aspect of this is influencing where your laner has to position and slowing the wave down before it crashes to your turret. W1 lays down a path in a straight line that grants movement speed to any allied champions that pass over it. This ability is really good for a lot of things, and anytime you're moving around the map is a great time to use it. It helps you get back to lane faster, roam faster, reposition, and so on and so forth. W2 will probably be your least used spell. It lays down a circle on the ground that grants Hwei and his allies a shield that will increase in strength over time. The shield is stronger for Hwei and weaker for allies, and since it doesn't grant a flat shield immediately and has to be used over time, it's really hard to use effectively. And not to mention the shield strength isn't too great anyways. Regardless, it still comes in clutch in certain situations and can help your team out during fights or objectives. W3 grants Hwei 3 circles, or something. For 9 seconds, these can be consumed to deal bonus damage and refund some mana through auto attacks or abilities. This ability is god tier. The small amount of mana you get back lets him stay in lane longer while also doing bonus damage since he has some severe mana and damage issues early game. I also want to mention that these orbs grant bonus damage to your passive as well, meaning that you can detonate all 3 of them with Q, auto, and then a passive burst to follow. And I will show you guys how to do that when I start talking about laning. E1 is a straight line nuke that fears and grounds the first target hit for about 1 second. It doesn't come out very fast and is only really reliable on a target that's already CC'd or directly on top of you. It doesn't come out very fast and is only really reliable on a target that's already CC'd or directly on top of you. E2 sends out an eye to the target location and after a brief delay will launch itself at the nearest enemy champion within the area, rooting and revealing them. The bolt can be blocked by other champions as well as minions, so throwing it in the middle of a minion wave won't yield good results. It is, however, extremely good for zoning or catching out slower targets. E3 is an AoE jaw that pulls targets towards the center of it after a very short delay. It has pretty good size and comes out fast enough that it's hard to dodge, so it's definitely your most reliable CC. That, and it's extremely good for clearing waves. Anytime you select a category of spells to choose from, whether it's Q, W, or E, you can cancel out of them by pressing R to return to your normal ability layout. If you're not familiar with Hwei and haven't played him a lot, he has a bunch of bugs right now that I don't know if will ever get fixed. There is one that I'll try to find some footage of where his abilities overlay incorrectly and it looks like you can cancel your abilities and you just end up ulting instead. I'll put that on screen if I find it. Finally, Hwei's ultimate is Spiraling Despair, a straight line skill shot that latches onto the first enemy hit, gradually increasing slow strength and size, eventually doing a big burst of damage to anyone in the area. This ability can be really strong since the slow nearly reaches the effectiveness of a root towards the end and can have a huge impact on teamfight. However, this ability is slow as hell. You will almost never land this on a target unless they're crowd controlled beforehand or channeling. That, and it has a pretty long cooldown, so you have to be really careful with how you use it. Moving on to runes, and then I'll talk about laning after that. There's a bunch of different runes you can take on Hwei, and most of the time they're going to be pretty effective no matter what, but you really need to focus on absolutely maximizing his potential. My simple answer is to take Arcane Comet or Summon Airy and flex your secondary page. I've played around with just about every combination of runes I could think of, and this is what I've found works the best, and I'll explain why. The first two setups I ran looked something like these. Dark Harvest seemed like a really obvious choice for him since it makes executing enemies with his Q2 way more effective, especially when running Coup de Grace secondary. The major downside to this setup is that while you're able to easily execute enemies below a certain threshold, you are very incapable of doing legitimate damage to anyone above that threshold. And since this setup relies heavily on doing damage, it means that running mana growth and ramping damage on your secondary page just proves to be less effective. I think this page is extremely fun in certain cases, but overall is not reliable. Looking over at First Strike, I see some of these same issues. Hwei having a ton of built-in utility means that forcing yourself to spec into the inspiration page is kind of a moot point. Granted, there are aspects of this that do help him, like the bonus damage potions and whatnot, but it feels a lot more like a bandage to some of his issues rather than a buff. And with how slow his spells come out in certain fights, it leaves First Strike very limited in its effectiveness. Just to make this point more clear, here's an example. Hwei excels at making short burst trades in lane in order to whittle down his opponent to a point where he's able to catch them off guard and execute them most likely with his Q2, whether it's via crowd controlling them with E or his ult. The problem with First Strike is that you can't always anticipate and use its cooldown properly, especially since mages have a hard time getting all their spells off in a short time while effectively landing them, which means you can easily burn it on accident just by poking. As for the gold gained by the damage dealt, it's pretty meh. Early game damage really isn't high enough for this to matter, and it only really starts to make a difference if you're really fed, and by that point you've probably snowballed enough that you don't need the gold as much. Back to the rune pages that do actually work well and consistently. The end-all be-all here is Arcane Comet. It works well since it boosts Hwei's early game poke because his damage is relatively low and makes it easier to whittle down people without expending as much mana. That and the cooldown refund on landing other abilities really helps him out. The alternative to this is Summon Airy for a similar reason. Summon Airy can be strong because it has a very short cooldown and is guaranteed to land on any kind of damage you use. The consistency is what you're really looking for here, but the trade-off is doing a little less damage than you would with Arcane Comet. As for the rest of the page, I always go Mana Flow Band to help cope with his mana issues, Transcendence so you can effectively spam artillery, especially late game with Absolute Focus as an alternative depending on matchups, and finally Scorch for a little more of that guaranteed damage. As for secondary runes, you have a lot of options. My go-to is Precision with Presence of Mind to help out with mana in lane, and Coup de Grace for that sweet execute damage. These really function as a steroid to what he's already doing instead of opting for more utility and missing out on damage. Another option is Domination with Ghost Poro to help avoid ganks since you're relatively immobile in Cheap Shot or Ultimate Hunter. Cheap Shot helps you get that poke damage after you land some form of your E, but can be inconsistent, while Ultimate Hunter helps out your ult cooldown, especially when combined with Malignance, which makes team fighting really strong, but again, this means you're opting for more utility stats instead of damage, so I would consider the team comps before taking this. And for the last of the secondaries, I would take Resolve in matchups that are typically very one-sided and have high burst like Nefiri, Echo, Syndra, and Ahri. There are of course others, but I'll talk about matchups in a little bit. Since Hwei has a fairly weak early game and is prone to burst trades, I usually take Bone Plating and either Overgrowth or Unflinching. Overgrowth is great for late game against burst champions, while Unflinching is kind of just stronger for early game if your laner or enemy jungler has a hard CC, so most of the time I would just take Overgrowth. As for shards, you should almost always run double adaptive damage and health. In summary, your primary rune page should almost look like one of these, and in these matchups your secondary page should look something like this. And speaking of matchups, let's take a look at some of them. Hwei is somewhere between a control mage and an artillery mage since some of his strongest spells have a large AoE with strong effects or have high range and high damage. This means that his biggest downsides are having low mobility, long cooldowns on his stronger spells, and a low maximum health. Because of that, some of his worst matchups are against champions with high burst and mobility, so let's go down the list. At the top are the worst of the worst, and at the bottom are the not so worst of the worst. For pretty obvious reasons, at the top are Zed, Naafiri, Fizz, Echo, and Ahri. I feel like I really don't have to say much about Zed. He should be your permaban if you main Hwei, as he is the veritable bane of your existence and will win lane 9 times out of 10. He has too much burst on too little cooldown with extreme mobility and can freely roam and punish other lanes. Naafiri is fairly similar and has an insane early game advantage with too many options to avoid your important CC abilities as well as having high burst damage. That and her dogs interfere with you landing your spells effectively, especially your Q2. The dogs alone can basically win the lane for her all on their own. Fizz and Echo are pretty much in the same boat with high mobility, burst, and roaming potential. They will win almost every early game trade and have strong options to avoid your CC. Ahri is a special case where she basically doubles as a mid-range caster, meaning she's hard to trade with early game, and as soon as she hits level 6, she can decisively win any engage using her ult, especially when paired with Malignance, meaning she can ult almost every time she returns to lane or roams. On the lower half of bad matchups, we have Syndra, Yasuo, Akshan, and Zoe. Syndra is one of my least favorite lanes because no matter how well you play the matchup, you will get outscaled and end up trading kills even when you're ahead. Her QE combo has too much range and damage without giving enough time to trade back. She can effectively trade kills with you so long as she has ult and her damage comes out a lot faster than Hwei's. Yasuo is more or less a skill-based matchup where he will always be extremely frustrating to lane against, but someone who is very good at him will usually win. His E makes it easy to dodge most of Hwei's abilities, that and his wind wall can effectively shut you out of an entire teamfight. Akshan and other DPS-type champions are always bad since they have constant pressure and will always win long-term trades, especially early game. Zoe has short cooldowns, mobility, and easy damage that makes laning against her difficult where she's hard to punish. Most of this stems from her being able to reposition at a moment's notice with her ult and land her Qs anytime she feels like it. Moving on to Hwei's better matchups. At the top are the easiest champions to play against, and on the bottom are some of the more or less neutral matchups. We have Aurelion Sol, Galio, Orianna, Azir, and Xerath. Aurelion Sol is by far the easiest matchup because he has to stand still to channel his Q, giving you a free Q2 on him, and his E basically telegraphs where he's going, making it very easy to land your CC on him. Galio is usually a problem for mages of a similar caliber, but Hwei has decently ranged spells, and landing your E1 on Galio is almost guaranteed when he tries to dash on you. Orianna has decent zoning potential, but her range is far too short to avoid your poke, making it easy to stay away from her. For the more neutral matchups, Azir isn't too much of a problem and can usually be countered pretty easily since he has to be in range of his soldiers and stand still to auto-attack, making it very easy for you to land your spells. However, he does have decent trade potential, and at level 6 you have to be extremely careful with your positioning or he can catch you out with his ult. Finally, we have Xerath. Poking Xerath with Q2 is pretty easy since he slows himself down when charging Q and is forced to commit to it. That and his other spells force him to stop momentarily to cast them or entirely during his ult. The downside of this lane is that his poke is very long range and can go through your wave, meaning you have to be very good at dodging and positioning as to not get whittled down. Alright, that's enough of scripted me. I'm going to let unscripted me take over for a little bit to talk about laning and gameplay. Hello, it's me, Unscripted Noodle. I'm here to talk about laning and combos and how to use your abilities. First thing I want to talk about is your W3. This ability is going to be your end-all be-all for getting your mana back, poking, and just kind of staying in lane. I think the best thing to note about this ability is that it's very easy to use in the sense that you can put it up before you start casting spells. So you can put it up, do your QQ, auto-attack, E3, whatever you want to do. But another thing to note about this is that this ability can be cast during one of your other spells while it's flying in the air. So if you wanted to do a Q1 on somebody, you could W3 right afterwards, and it'll take up that dot while it's flying through the air. I would say for the most part, the only time you're really going to use that mechanic is if you're going to Q2 somebody from far away, and it gives you ample time to put it up, and you're not going to mess up and recast a different spell instead. So usually 90% of the time, if it is already up, I would put it up before you decide to cast any of your other spells. As I also mentioned before, your W3 does affect your passive as well, so that short burst trade that I was talking about where you can effectively get all 3 of those marks off with just 2 spells is to have them up, throw an auto attack or your Q1 or whatever other ability first, and it'll detonate all 3 of your marks, getting the maximum amount of damage and the mana back. You can do them by putting them up, queuing first, and then auto attacking, and then getting the mark. That's going to be your bread and butter trade for early game, especially if you take W second. As for which abilities to take in what order, you're always going to take your Q first. And then after that, you're going to take your E if you're up against somebody like Fizz, Echo, or Nefiri, somebody who's going to try to jump on you. And in some cases, people like Ari, so you can zone them off of you while you hold your wave back from the turret. In cases where you have the advantage against other mid-ranged casters, you want to take your W so you can get that mana back and shove in if you need to. Here, I want to show you a big reason that taking your Q first is really important, other than it just being good damage and a low cooldown. As soon as the game starts, you want to run all the way up here through your mid. Don't take mid lane because you don't want your laner to see you, and come up right into this bush and just wait right around here. At about 1 minute and 20 seconds, you can Q2 this bush up here, and you will either see your Arcane Comet or Summon Airy go off, and you'll get this little status above your bar, and you know that somebody's there. If somebody isn't there, then you should walk all the way up here and put a warding trinket right on the enemy jungler's raptors. This early vision is kind of just an end-all be-all for most mid laners and is super, super crucial to tell where the enemy jungler is. Alright, so back to combos and which ones you're going to use the most. Obviously, your goal is to get your passive off as much as possible, especially early game, since it doesn't cost you anything and it is just bonus damage. Obviously, your easiest way of doing that is going to be against some champions that don't have as much of an advantage against you, where you can walk up and auto-attack them with your orbs. Even if you do multiple in a row, it won't detonate your passive, but as long as one of those is an ability of some sort, you will always get your passive off. Most of the time, you want to go with stuff that is almost guaranteed to land. That's why your E3 is really good for it, because it goes through minions and everything, and sometimes your Q3. So, some of your best paired abilities together. If you're looking for peel and somebody is directly on top of you, that is one of the few situations you'll actually use E1. Otherwise, this ability is incredibly slow, so you have to be really careful how you use it. It takes a very long time to travel, and it's not that big. It's a decent size. Most of the time, you're going to use it when they're right on top of you, which gives you a perfect opportunity to E1 and Q1 right after and walk away. That's going to give you your full passive trade, and that's going to get them off of you for a moment. In some cases, depending on the matchup, it may be good to E1 them and then throw your Rift down, because it stems from wherever you are, and if they're chasing you to your turret, they will have to walk all the way on it and be slowed the whole time, and you're going to have the advantage because you're safer here. But in most cases, if you're just trying to get away, I wouldn't even take the time to Q1 afterwards. One of your most effective and useful trading options is to put down your Q3, your big rift, in the middle of the wave, making it look like you're trying to clear it out, and then E3 them into it, which I failed to do. This is really hard for them to dodge, and it's going to pull them directly into the rift. It's going to take damage from both of those, as well as your passive. Obviously, if you can, you want your W3 up first, and that's going to give you all three of your marks detonated, and it's going to do a lot of damage to them. As for utilizing your Q2, obviously this spell does absolutely no damage to anybody that's full health, and will only really be effective if they are isolated, crowd controlled, like a hard CC, not a slow, or if they are already below the threshold. The best ways you're going to use this is on champions that are much, much slower and are liking to position away from their minions where you can land it, but most of the time you're going to land it with your E2. This spell has a long enough root duration and a decent enough range that you can get your Q2 off from wherever you are. Most of the time it's not going to be super effective, but when people are running around the map mid to late game and aren't really paying attention, you can usually throw your E2 around and somebody will accidentally walk into it, giving you a bunch of free damage, if not a full-on kill. One of your most used combos for your Q2 as well is going to be paired with your ultimate. Since this thing basically gets to the strength of a root, while they're walking around, they're going to be forced to slow down a whole lot, and right at the end of it, you should get a guaranteed Q2 on them because they can barely move unless they have flash. Another way to use your ult that you might be able to land it, and it's not always effective, is to use your E3 and pull them towards the center of it, and then you can throw your ultimate directly after, and since they get slowed by the E3, they are most likely to get hit by it. Kind of like that. It catches people off guard a lot, but it's not the most effective. Obviously, if you can, try to land your E1 or your E2 on them before landing your ult, because it's guaranteed that way. But sometimes when they're positioned up against a wall or something, it can land pretty well if you do it right. When you're in team fights, you mostly want to throw your spells that you know will land, like your Q1. If you're trying to peel for your teammates, like your carry or something, and you're not super fed, make sure they get right on top of them before you land your E1, or they've exhausted whatever mobility they have. Otherwise, if you're looking to zone people out and cut off choke points, your Q3 has a massive tool for that. And a lot of times when you're in tight spaces like Dragon or Baron Pit, you can throw it down and pull a lot of people into it to get a ton of damage with your passive since it marks everybody. Your E3 is going to be your bread and butter for teamfights a lot of the time because you'll usually get at least 2 or 3 people with it. This also pairs really well with your E3 and your ult because it's going to pull a lot of people to the same spot and everybody's going to scatter, meaning that if you throw your ults in any direction, it will almost guaranteed to be land on somebody. Especially in situations like that where you're fighting for an objective, if you do hit somebody important with that eyeball, it is good to land your ult right on them afterwards, so that can slow them down, if not kill them, before they're able to get in here and do anything meaningful. Well, that's all I have to say without going super in-depth. I will have full gameplays with commentary at some point up that talk a little more about that, but for now, that's all I got, so back to Scripted Noodle. Thank you, Unscripted Me. We are back to the script now to talk about builds. I'm going to go down the list of his core items to break down when and why you should build them, but really quickly let's go over summoners and starting items. You should always take Flash, no matter what, and second to that, Ghost or Teleport. In my experience, I only ever take Ghost, but if you're less experienced and know your matchup will be hard, then I would take Teleport to soften the blow of being put behind. Ghost, on the other hand, is extremely good for his mobility and roaming, making it easier to gank other lanes and reposition quickly during a fight. As for starting items, you should always be taking Mana Tear and Potions. I don't ever take Doran's Ring because it has short-term gains with no payoff, meaning it gives no significant stats and doesn't build into anything. Taking Tear first is important because it gives you some decent mana and allows you to start stacking early on so you don't struggle as much with Hwei's obscene mana costs. That then gives you the option to build into Archangels first in case you're against any of these champions. All the bonus mana also helps you shove out your lane more often, meaning you can roam and avoid fighting your laner, or it can help negate some of their burst and keep you alive more often once it evolves into Seraph's Embrace. If you're not against any of these champions, then you can usually build Archangels second or third. The premier choice for your first item would have to be Shadow Flame. This gives you a ton of AP and really amps up your execute damage with your full combo. The downside is that it doesn't offer anything for health or mana, so if you have a lane that swings in your favor, then most of the time you should be building this first. Liandry's Torment is an optional item that grants health and helps out a little bit with wave clear, but the biggest reason you'll ever build this is because the enemy team has a lot of health stackers. The percent health bonus damage makes a massive difference, and if there are at least 2 tanky people on the enemy team, then you should absolutely have this. Usually this only needs to be your second or third item and is rarely a great option for your first unless you're laning directly against a tank or some kind of scaling health mage like Cassiopeia or Vladimir. Malignance is a really strong item right now due to its ultimate cooldown reduction and bonus damage, but on Hwei it can be problematic. Hwei's ult is pretty strong and has a fairly long cooldown, but is extremely hard to land in a lot of situations, meaning that Malignance will oftentimes be underutilized unless you're playing specifically for teamfights. It can be solid as a first item since it builds out of Lost Chapter, which helps you retain mana early game, but should only ever be rushed if your laner or most of the enemy team is extremely immobile, meaning you can land your ult more often. Other than that, I really can't recommend it overall, and you should usually be going for higher damage on your basic abilities. Moving towards mid to late game, when you have your core items built, you can usually decide what to go based on how the match plays out. If you're extremely fed, then you should be trying to get Death Cap, where if you're behind and getting picked off easily, then consider going Zhonya's or Banshee's Veil. Once you hit level 9, you should swap out for the blue trinket so you can ward more safely and occasionally scry for a quick kill with Q2. As for boots, you should only ever be going Sorcerer's Shoes since there really isn't a good reason to go anything else. I'll put some examples on screen right now to briefly show what your build path should look like in specific matchups and situations, so feel free to pause and read them at your own pace. Alright, last but certainly not least, let's talk about pocket picks. As much as I would like to play Hwei and Hwei alone, it simply isn't possible, so it's important to have a few backup champions that you are comfortable with. My personal picks are Orianna, Lux, and Morgana. Orianna has always been one of my favorite champions, so this might be a little biased, but she has a similar zoning and teamfight playstyle and can have a massive impact on the outcome of your games if you get relatively good at her. Of course, she has similar downsides to Hwei, especially considering she doesn't have access to a hard CC before level 6, and even at that point her ult can be very hard to land and has a massive cooldown which can be slightly mitigated with Malignance. Lux, I would say, plays a little safer as an artillery mage and has a pretty lame playstyle where all you have to do is ult your minion waves and push in your laner. By late game, you should have some decent farm and high damage, allowing you to dish out ultimates every 20 seconds, making it hard for the enemy carries to position or just picking them off entirely. And finally, Morgana is more or less of a situational pick, but she essentially functions as an anti-mage with how easily she can push out waves and avoid CC with Black Shield while also having extremely strong pick potential. She's not as strong of a pick against assassins, but fares well into wave pushers and hard CC mages like Anivia, Lux, and even Hwei himself. Alright, I'm going to do one final breakdown to summarize what your playstyle and match pacing should look like on Hwei. As a mid to long range control / artillery mage, your goal is to play safe and scale to late game, making full use of your strong CC and AoE during teamfights. Early game is a struggle due to his relatively low damage and high mana costs, meaning you have to be very precise with how you use your spells in order to avoid hard engages from the enemy laner and jungler while maintaining good farm. Despite these disadvantages, Hwei excels at roaming for minor objectives and ganks. You should always keep track of your junglers so you can follow them to help with void grubs or even look for a roam on other lanes. These fights can help you snowball into mid-game if you come out with kills, assists, or objectives, since solo killing your laner isn't always an option. Mid to late game is where Hwei really shines with his ability to dish out high damage from afar on relatively low cooldown, especially in choke points where the enemy has a harder time avoiding your abilities. Even when underfed, Hwei plays a huge role in teamfights by controlling areas and even peeling for allies, but still struggles with getting caught out by hard engagers. One of the most crucial skills is knowing how to itemize properly, allowing you to deal with different classes of champions either by maximizing your own damage and utility or preventing the enemy from fully utilizing their own, whether it's by denying healing with Grievous Wounds, denying easy picks with Banshee's Veil or Zhonya's, or by playing a glass cannon build and trading picks with the enemy carries. All in all, your positioning and ability to land spells effectively and consistently at the right times is what's really going to make this champion work. That's all I have to say for now. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you in the next one.